Zend Avesta Part 3, the Yasna, Isparod, Afrinagon, Goss, and Miscellaneous Fragments, translated by L.H. Mills. The Preface. It would savor of affection for me to say very much by way of meeting the necessary disadvantages under which I labor, as in any sense a successor of Professor Darmesteter. It is sufficient to state that I believe myself to be fully aware of them, and that I trust those who study my work will accord me the more sympathy under the circumstances. Professor Darmesteter, having extended his labors in his university, found his entire time so occupied that he was obliged to decline further labor on this series for the present. My work on the Gathas had been for some time in his hands, and he requested me as a friend to write the still needed volume of the translation of the Avesta, although deeply appreciated by undesirableness of following one whose scholarship is only surpassed by his genius. I found myself unable to refuse. As to my general treatment, experts will not need to be informed that I have labored under no common circumstances, difficulties. On the one hand, it would be extremely imprudent for any scholar not placed arbitrarily beyond the reach of criticism to venture to produce a translation of the Yasna, Visparod, Afrinagon, and Goss without defensive notes. The smallest freedom would be hypercriticized. By interested parties, and after them condemned by their followers. Now, a lot of the criticism that I would have laid, it's not so much criticism as in language used from one century to the next. On the other hand, even with the imperfect commentary which accompanies the Gathas here, the general courtesy of the delegates of the Clarendon Press has been too abundantly drawn upon. One does not expect detailed commentaries in this series. My efforts have, therefore, been chiefly confined to forestalling the possible assaults of unfair or forgetful critics, and so to spare myself, in so far as it may be possible, the necessity for painful rejoinder. To print a commentary on the Yasna, etc., which would be clear to non-specialists, and at the same time interesting, would occupy many times more space than could be allowed here. In treating the Gathas, however, even at the risk of too great extension, I have endeavored to atone for the necessary obscurity of the notes by ample summaries, and a translation supported by paraphrase, as such matter has more prospect of being generally instructive than a commentary which must necessarily have remained obscure. These summaries should also be read with the more indulgence, as they are the first of their kind yet attempted, Haug's having been different in their scope. With regard to all matters of mere form, I expect from all sides a similar concession. It will, I trust, be regarded as a sufficient result if a translation which has been built up upon the strictest critical principles can be made at all readable. For while any student may transcribe from the works of others what might be called a translation of the Yasna, to render that part of it termed the Gathas has been declared by a respectable authority the severest task in Aryan philology, and certainly if the extent of preparatory studies alone is to be the gauge, the statement cited would not seem to be an exaggeration. Okay, some statement in German. Oh. Okay, yeah, we're not on that note yet. On mathematical estimates, the amount of labor which seems to have gone through to become an independent investigator seems to be much greater than that which presents itself before specialists in more favored departments. No one should think of writing with originality on the Gathas or the rest of this Avesta who had not long studied the Vedic Sanskrit, and no one should think of pronouncing ultimate opinions on the Gathas who has not, to a respectable degree, mastered the Pahlavi commentaries. Well, we can comment on something itself without commenting through the conservative tradition, and that goes for any faith. But, while the Vedic, thanks to the labors of the editor and lexicographers, has long been open to hopeful study, the Pahlavi commentaries have never been thoroughly made out, and writer after writer advances with an open avowal to that effect, while the explanation, if attempted, involves questions of actual decipherment, and Persian studies in general, to those of the Sanskrit and Zend, and the language of the Gathas requires also the study of a severe comparative philology, and that to an unusual, if not unequaled extent. The keen observer will at once see that the department of science so circumstanced may cause especial embarrassment. On the one hand, it is exposed to the impositions of dilettante, and the hard-working specialist must be content to see those who had advanced with studies one half or less than one half completed, consulted as masters by a public which is only ignorant as regards the innermost laws of the science, and, on the other hand, the deficiencies of even the most laborious specialist must leap chasms of imperfection out of which the war of the methods must continually re-arise. In handling the Gathas especially, I have resorted to the plan of giving a translation which is inclusively literal, but filled out and rounded out as to form by the free use of additions. That is approximately so. Absolute literalness, even when treated as I propose, would be unmanageably awkward. In another work, I give a word-for-word rendering of the Gathas. As the serious student should read with a strong negative criticism, he may notice that I strive occasionally after a more pleasing effect, but as we lose the metrical flow of the original entirely, such an effort to put the rendering somewhat on a level with the original in this respect becomes a real necessity. I have, however, in order to guard against misleading the reader, generally but not always indicated the added words by parenthetical curves, that these will be considered unsightly and awkward, I am well aware. I consider them such myself, but have not felt at liberty to refrain from using them, as the Gathas are disputed word for word. I could not venture to resort to free omissions, and what a translation would be without either additions or omissions may be seen from the occasional word-for-word renderings given. Beyond the Gathas, I have omitted the curves. Oftener, I have, in the Gathas, as elsewhere, also endeavored to impart a rhythmical character to this translation, for the reason above given, and foreign readers should especially note the fact, as well as my effort to preserve the color of the original expressions, otherwise they will inevitably inquire why I do not spare words to preserve the color and warmth, and at the same time to include a literal rendering. It is impossible to spare words and syllables, and it is unwise to attempt it. Non-specialists may dislike the frequency of alternative renderings as leaving the impression of indecision, while at the same time a decision is always expressed by the adoption of a preferred rendering. The alternatives were added with the object of showing how nearly balanced probabilities may be, and also how important to the general sense the question among specialists often are. Now, in the Quran, sometimes you see a translation, you can take a handful of lines to properly translate the one line. And I'm not just talking about, those handful of terms in Surah 5, 103. But you're not going to see, but there's not contradictions. Just because there's variations of meanings that come out doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have contradictions. Now, you do find that in some texts, but in translating, I have followed the plan used in the preceding volumes to avoid confusion, but since the first volume was published, great progress has been made in this particular, and in a separate work, I should have adopted a different arrangement. As to other important variations from the preceding volumes in matters of usage and fashion, I trust no one will dwell on them for a moment. As in Arama'ete, Ohu Mana, etc., I also write Ner Yosang, and in a few places Gatha'a, Ahuna Va'ete, etc. I regret not having written Mazda everywhere. As regards to the usual and inevitable differences of opinion on more serious questions, see the remarks in the introduction. Where I differ from Professor Darmesteter, I desire to be considered as merely proposing alternative renderings. I have therefore omitted a mass of references to the previous volumes as unnecessary. I would also state that I have often avoided rendering identical passages in identical language as irksome both to reader and writer. I have also not invariably cited the obviously preferable variations of text which have been adopted and which are so familiar to the eye, which in Westergaard, Spiegel, and Geltner. The text of Westergaard have been followed necessarily as to the extent of matter. As this work is printed before the completion of Geltner's text, the oft-recurring formulas and prayers at the ends of the chapters and sections have been left unrendered, and finally, for the most part, unnoticed. By striking out the useless notes, citations of the Pahlavi and Sanskrit translations have been given occasionally in full, in order to meet the extraordinary statements which sometimes appear to the effect that they have not been vital to the interpretation of the Gathas. But by giving these extracts, and by frequently citing the Pahlavi, Nayusang, and the Persian, I have perhaps exposed myself to the misconception that I am an extreme advocate of the so-called tradition, whereas all conscientious critics will acknowledge that I follow the indications of these works with more reserve than any writer who professes to have studied them. In fact, I may well apprehend censure from traditionalists in this particular. The relics of a tradition direct from the fountainhead are present in the Asiatic commentaries, and also the relics of a tradition from later, as it were, modern scholarship, and lastly, there are also present in direct results of an ancient scholarships. But to speak of the Pahlavi translations as tradition is merely to us a convenient phrase. I know of no scholar who supposes these commentaries be, in a simple sense, tradition from the earliest Zend writers. These Asiatic renderings are cited by me the more fully when those who neglect them agree with their indications, and they are therefore cited to show that, whereas those most opposed to them are nevertheless forgetfully indebted to them in nearly every line, therefore in all cases of great difficulty they should be studied as an absolute necessity before rash conjectures are adopted. For it is exactly where we are all most in doubt that their indications become of most worth when rationally considered. Now, except for the Quran, what religious tradition of old isn't mostly, doesn't require an intermediate translation stage? These translations should be examined for the relics of the truth, the hints, the traces, original explanations, which may most abound where they are themselves most faulty as translations. I therefore never search them for exact reproductions, but the citations which I give here constitute only a very small fraction of those needed. An argument should be built up on the fullest statements of the circumstances, elucidated with scientific completeness. This alone would have any prospect of obliging investigators to acknowledge the truth, for not only inertia and prejudice are arrayed on the other side, but even interest. As much is said of the Pahlavi translations, for Nair is properly cited only as a translation of a translation, and as such of the highest authority, so of the Persian. It is hoped that our occupations are sufficiently serious to allow us to pass over the imperfections of Nagyosang's Sanskrit style. He was especially cramped in his mode of expressing himself by a supposed necessity to attempt to follow his original, which was not the Gathic, but the Pahlavi, word for word. His services were most eminently scholarly, and, considering his disadvantages, some of the greatest which have been rendered. Professor R.V. Roth and Dr. Aurel Stein have kindly transcribed for me valuable variations. It will be regarded, however, as especially desirable that in a report from specialists to the learned public in general, the texts should on no account be violated by conjectural improvements where they are at all translatable. Alternatives are therefore added. It has been remarked by a recent reviewer on the new version of the Scriptures, there is scarcely a line of very ancient writing which scholars are not tempted to amend, but such emendations are seldom agreed to among specialists. At a first translation could always be attempted with the texts as they stand. Zendists will observe that I by no means abandon explanations merely because they are old, a practice which seems almost the fashion. I, however, fully approve testing and assailing again and again all suggestions, neither old or new, I would simply assert that while the text before us remains still so very extensive, it would be better for scholars to exercise their sagacity upon passages which call loudly for wise conjecture, leaving those which are clear as they stand for later assaults. It will be seen that I myself by no means approve of refraining from conjecture. Well, you need to make educated guesses. You don't just make up stuff, though. But I would, only in all humility, insist that we should not abandon ourselves to unprepared conjecture. Okay, I spoke too soon. As it is known, I have attempted the present rendering after more than 10 years of close labor, and after a full translation of the Pahlavi and Sanskrit translations, together with an edition of the Zend, Pahlavi, Sanskrit, and Persian texts of the Gathas. See the Athanatum, April 12th, 1884, and the Academy, September 13th, 1884, on the entire subject in its connection with the Gnostic and modern philosophies, and special labors have included a much longer period of time than that mentioned. It is proper to add that for the purpose of keeping the judgment free from prejudice and open to honest conviction from the influence of the Rig Veda, I have followed the practice for a number of years of transcribing the hymns of the Veda into English in word-for-word written studies, having already so treated by far the greater part of them. Some of these are in curtailed statement, others needlessly full. I have also, on the other hand, turned a large portion of the Gathas into Vedic Sanskrit. This, however, is practically a universal custom, as all words are compared with the Vedic, so far as analogies exist between the Gathas and the Riks. If, therefore, the opposed schools regard me as erring and too implicit a reliance on the hints of the Asiatics on the one side, or in too decided a tendency to read the Gathic as Vedic on the other, they may be assured that I have not erred from interest or prejudice, that my results will please both parties. It is folly to expect, in fact, perfection in the rendering of the Gathas, as of some other ancient works, is forever unattainable, and not to be looked for. Moreover, it would not be recognized if attained, for no writer, whosoever he may be, can produce a rendering of the Gathas without meeting the assaults of ignorance or design. However imperfect my results may be supposed to be, it is hoped that they will contribute some little toward establishing a convention among scholars as to what the Gathic and Zend writings mean. Meanwhile, it is confidently expected that they will fulfill the requirements of the science of comparative theology. Whatever may be the ultimate truth as to questions of close detail, the Yasna, as well as the rest of the Avesta, is clear as to its creed. My list of obligations is a long one, in fact, so long that I fear I can express but little compliment in naming advisers, as I have made it a practice to consult all available persons, as well as books, making one exception. I will therefore reserve to myself the pleasure of recalling them to a future occasion. It is sufficient to say here that while I follow a new departure in the treatment of the Asiatic commentaries, yet the most prominent writers of the opposing schools have courteously favored me with their advice. Availing myself of the exception named, I would take the liberty to express my gratitude especially to Dr. E. W. West, our first authority on Pahlavi, for placing at my disposal various readings of the Pahlavi text of the Yasna, of which we have hitherto only possessed a single manuscript in the Pahlavi character that contained the oldest Zend writing, the Codex Numbered 5. In the Library of Copenhagen. The variation referred to here, translated by Dr. West, from the venerable manuscript, The Hereditary Property of Dr. Gmaspge Menakharge Asana of Bombay, and written only 19 or 22 days later than that numbered 5 in the Library of Copenhagen. By this generous loan, I've been enabled to print elsewhere the first text of the Pahlavi of the Gathas, yet edited with comparison of manuscript. Likewise, also for the first time translated in its entirety into a European language. For this Dr. West, during an extended correspondence, has furnished me with information on the Pahlavi not attainable elsewhere, together with corrections and revisions. There is another eminent friend whose sacrifices of time and labor on my behalf have been exceptional, but I will defer the mention of Zend scholars. I take this opportunity to express my acknowledgments to Professor Dr. von Halm of the Hof and Staatsbibliothek in Munich for allowing me the free use of Codex 12 of Haug's collection, both up at Stuttgart and Hanover. Also to Professor Dr. Willemans of Göttingen, Geheimrat Dr. Forstemann of Leipzig, and Herr Rath Bodemann of Hanover, for the loan of a large number of valuable works from the respective public libraries, often with great liberality renewed. Hanover, February 1886. L. H. Mills.